Before I continue the story of economic slavery through banking, an important matter has to be made clear first, that being what the practice of debasement represents. As per the available definition, debasement means, quote, the lowering of the value of a currency by reducing the amount of valuable metal in the coins, end quote. This definition might appear rather archaic and could easily be applied to the Roman Empire, but much less so to our modern monetary systems. But only if you knew how bad things really were. In order that we may understand what debasing a national currency does to the nation, how it begins, seemingly a trifle, how it gets out of hand, and eventually how things end, in the following we will look at the case of Rome, where the debasement of currency began with the reign of Emperor Nero, who was considered by the early Christians to be the Antichrist incarnate. But I digress. Suffice it to say, he had the empire go down a very slippery slope. In the year 64 AD, he decided on lowering the silver content of the denarius from 98% to 93.5%, while its weight was also reduced. Originally weighing 4.5 grams at its introduction in 211 BC, being brought down to 3.9 grams in 141 BC. It maintained its weight and silver content until the reign of Nero, when he reduced both its purity, as aforementioned, but also its weight, down to 3.4 grams. This apparently trivial change, in fact, representing something greater, the opening of the Pandora's box. As the empire expanded, the plebeian class grew exponentially, and the need for public spending with it. Between military campaigns, public works, and welfare programs, spending more money did not become just necessary for the functioning of the empire, but the popular and expected thing to do. Wage increases and bribes were demanded throughout the administration, while bread and circuses were demanded by the broader masses. As such, the increase in expenses of the state began outpacing the increases in revenue. To fund the very costly wars, a few decades later, Emperor Trajan further reduced the weight of the denarius to 3.2 grams, its silver content having already been reduced to around 90% by this point. By the time of Marcus Aurelius, there was a further drop in purity to around 85% silver content, but things really took a turn for the worst in the year 193 AD, also known as the Year of the Five Emperors, when Septimius Severus took charge of the empire that was in a state of civil war. In order to guarantee the army's support, he provided massive bribes and excessive wages with no regard for long-term consequences. He began thus a massive debasement campaign. In a few short years, by the year 197, the denarius's weight was down to 2.5 grams and the silver content down to as little as 50%. For some context, by the year 192, 403 years after its inception, the denarius had been devalued by roughly 38%, as one denarius was made out of 2.72 grams of pure silver, while by 197, that had dropped to 1.25 grams of pure silver, marking a 54% reduction in value over just 5 years, leading to a total debasement over 408 years of 72%, or about the same as was the case in England with the pound over the 23-year period from 1694 to 1717. In 212, the new emperor, Caracalla, granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free men. Before, only just above a tenth of the freeborn population were citizens. This progressive act, which might be seen by some as a great positive, but in fact, it was one of the last acts of desperation of a declining empire. As its natural-born population had been decreasing, the patricians in particular were having fewer and fewer children. The makeup of Rome had changed drastically from its glory days. Compared to the late Republic, when the population of Rome proper reached 1 million inhabitants, with the vast majority being of Italian origins, and just as well within the military, by the 3rd century, Italians were a minority both in Rome proper, where the population had decreased to roughly 500,000, and just as well within their own military, where the majority of the population were of North African and Middle Eastern origins. Before Caracalla, there was still some distinction in the matter of citizenship, but in order to massively increase the tax base, with no regard for social cohesion or the matter of Roman identity, which was what actually made Rome great to begin with, everybody became a citizen. Many, however, did not have enough money to pay the taxes imposed by the empire, and their situation only worsened as a result. And in the year 215, the emperor introduced a so-called double denarius called the Antoninus, which initially weighed just under 5 grams and was just under 50% pure silver. This was quickly devalued, however, and 20 years later, its silver content had dropped to around 10%, its weight being reduced also to as little as 3 grams. By this point, the coins were made out of mostly bronze with a thin silver coating. By the mid-3rd century, as the chaos of the crisis was in full swing, multiple usurpers came to mint their own coins with lower and lower quality, and before Diocletian took control of the empire in 284, the silver content had dropped to as little as 2%, in some cases the coins having no silver in them whatsoever, being made out of mostly copper and bronze. For some context, in the year 100 AD, a modius of wheat, 6.5 kilograms or 14.3 pounds, costed 1 denarius, which was 95 to 98% silver. By the end of the 3rd century, the same modius of wheat costed 100 denarii. Diocletian attempted an actual reform, but the results were rather mixed. The empire began minting the aureus, a gold coin of 5.45 grams of pure gold, reserved for high-value transactions, and the argentius, that weighed 3.4 grams and was 95% silver, alongside the follis, which weighed 8 to 10 grams but was mostly bronze and had little value. The coins were standardized and began being minted in order to replace all the previously minted debased coins, but with little success, as the continuously large spending of the administration led to further debasement. Another issue was the state-mandated exchange rate between gold and silver, there being a fixed conversion rate of 1 aureus to 60 argentius, meaning nearly 1 to 40 gold to silver ratio, while in the Republic years it fluctuated between 112 to 115. Diocletian thus overvalued silver by a factor of 3 to discourage gold hoarding, which by this point was a significant issue, but as silver coins were minted to pay for most state expenses like wages, the coins continued to rapidly be debased. He also resolved to price fixing, issuing the Edict of Maximum Prices in 301, dictating maximum prices of goods and services, maximum wages for workers and soldiers, with violations being punishable by death. This edict was, however, largely ignored, as it was difficult to enforce, and it led to hoarding, shortages, and flourishing black markets. He also increased taxation, creating a new system which was much more rigid and bureaucratic, that was based on land and labor, which led to an increase in poverty. By 312, both the argentius and aureus had been debased, when Constantine the Great replaced them with a new argentius of 3 grams and 90% silver, and the solidus, 4.5 grams of pure gold. A year later, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting tolerance to Christians after his own conversion, and in 330, Constantine moved the capital to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople, marking the beginning of the Byzantine Empire and arguably the beginning of the end for Rome, and what in 395 officially became the Western Roman Empire. Indeed, Rome continued to decline as the power began being centralized in and around the new capital. In 380, Christianity became state religion, and the split between Rome and Constantinople further increased, especially with the splitting of the empire 15 years later. Following this, the Eastern Empire was held together fairly well and managed to last in some form or another for more than a millennium, not in small part because of a much more sensible economic policy, this time centered on gold, with the solidus remaining a reliable coin, maintaining its value for over 700 years. The administration of the Eastern Empire tightly regulated the minting of coins, maintaining high standards into the 12th century when the empire eventually began to decline. If there is anything we can learn from the Roman Empire, is that debasing the national currency always leads to a slow and painful decline and the ultimate collapse of the civilization, no matter how great it once was. Rome should have been a cautionary tale, and for many years it was. In the next video, we will look at the early history of banking in the United States and how it paved the way for our modern global economy.